or Sutra number 49, which says Shruta Anumana Pragnabhyam Anya Vishaya Vishesha Arthatvat. The knowledge which is gained from inference, that is Anumana, and the study of scriptures. Shruta means the study of scriptures. Shruti. Anumana Pragnabhyam is the knowledge of one kind. It is a different type of knowledge which we get by reading the scriptures, by understanding the scriptures, and getting and inferring something from that. So the inference is used. We don't have a direct experience of that kind of knowledge, but it is an indirect kind of knowledge which we get. But the the knowledge which is gained from samadhi, the nirvichara samadhi, as we discussed, is of a much higher order. It goes beyond inference and scriptures. So that is those are the two types of knowledge which Patanjali discusses. Here he is discussing two kinds of knowledge: knowledge obtained through meditation of the senses and reason. Senses also are involved in our perception. And the second type of knowledge, which is a superior knowledge, is obtained by direct superconscious experience, where our senses and the mind, the mental modes, they don't have any role to play. They are superseded, as it were. So ordinary knowledge comes to us by way of sense perception. We perceive certain things, we interpret those perceptions, and make some inference and try to do some kind of guesswork with the help of our reason. Ordinary knowledge is therefore, we can see, necessarily it is limited to ordinary objects. That is to say, those kinds of phenomena which are within the grasp of our sense perceptions. When ordinary knowledge, the one which we get by sense perception and using our intelligence or mind, the buddhi and all those things, they try to we try to find out, are there ways and means where we can enhance the perception and get higher and higher knowledge, intuitive knowledge. So as a result of this, we develop our minds, we develop our buddhi. And as the buddhi develops, you find that we don't depend on sensory perception. We use inference to a large extent. Suppose there is a smoke. If we have the knowledge of how fire results in smoke, then any smoke that gives us an idea of what might be the cause of the smoke. It may be some bomb blast, or it may be some just plain fire, wooden fire. So depending on the nature of the smoke, we make a lot of inferences and try to guess what may be the cause of that smoke. So, but extraordinary knowledge or supersensuous knowledge is far, far superior to this. No matter how much buddhi we have, how much our intellect is refined, and how much of the scriptural understanding we have about the existence of God, they have no value unless we experience the Godhood or the reality ourselves. We may read the books, we may accept their teachings up to a certain point, or we may say that we may even prove it to others. Not only do we get convinced, but we may develop a capacity to convince others, but it is only up to a certain point. After that, we cannot claim to know God because we have not experienced Him. That was the problem which was primary in the mind of Swami Vivekananda when he read all the books, different conceptions of God. And even in the different conceptions of God that he studied, he saw that there was so much variety, so much diversity of opinion. So he was like a true rational person should be. That is why reason has a place in our spiritual life. It's not that reason should be superseded. Reason definitely plays a role. Otherwise, we will become superstitious. So in our pursuit of knowledge, we have to go through all these exercises of using our intellect to the maximum possible extent. And but still we can't claim unless we have a direct experience. That is why Swami Vivekananda asked Sri Ramakrishna, have you seen God? Means his idea was, can you perceive God or reality or consciousness as we perceive this world around us? You say this all consciousness is all pervading. Uh, all those things are there in various philosophies. Even the European or Western philosophy have this idea of a immanent God and a transcendent God. So difference of there is difference of opinion among scholars. But for a true spiritual seeker, these answers are not enough. He may be satisfied with a particular answer and be intellectually satisfied, but up to a certain point. Just because we have read all the different opinions about or different ideas, they may not be merely opinions. For example, when you say the Upanishads, we believe that the Upanishadic rishis had that realization. They had experienced God in that particular way. So, but whether they experienced or not, it will not make any difference unless we experience all those things ourselves. So why should we believe? The question may be asked, a modern scientific mind may ask, why should we believe that whatever is written in the scriptures, however great the authority of that scripture and however large the following it may following of that particular scripture. So people may follow, but that doesn't mean that all the scriptures are, uh, even if they're genuine, what does it matter? As Swami Vivekananda famously once said, Moses might have seen some vision, Jesus might have seen, but what does it matter to you? What difference will it make in your life? Will it make you better? Will it transform you? That is the question. So whether we believe in them or not, we cannot claim that we have understood the truth behind the scriptures. Our reason may suggest to us that the authors of these books may be honest, reliable, definitely they are not self-deluded. So we might be inclined to believe what they tell us. But such a belief can only be partial. It can't be fully satisfactory. Naren read a lot of books. Vivekananda read a lot of books. Western philosophers, Indian philosophers, and many other books he read about the proof and the existence of God. But after all, however much faith we have in these books, the belief can be only partial and at the most provisional. And that is unsatisfactory to a real seeker. A real religious seeker will not find satisfaction in intricate theories or even simple theories about God, however much attractive they may be. So now we have two alternatives. We must decide that there is only one kind of knowledge, that is a typical worldly view, that how can there be so many kinds of knowledge? The only kind of knowledge is that which can be limited to objects of sense contact, because that is, we are sure of it. Everybody sees the similar type of object, though the perception may differ. A blind person may see the world in a different way, but still, when you touch a chair or see objects around you, more or less the impression everybody has is the same. So we think this is a more definite type of knowledge. So we become permanently agnostic about higher truths because we have never experienced that. Or the scriptures. He said we do not, it is very easy to say that I don't believe in the authority of the scriptures. They may be important to you. You may have great respect for all these religious founders or spiritual personalities. But what they saw, unless I see, I would not believe it. And that kind of agnosticism was supported by Sri Ramakrishna also. He never asked Naren to believe. Only when he asked him, did you see God? He said, no, I saw him not only as I see you, but in a much more intenser sense. So that aroused a curiosity in Narendra. He said, I want to see that then. If you say you can see God and see Him in a much more powerful way, then even I would like to see Him. So, but those things we have to follow a certain procedure. Just as you cannot understand the intricacies of uh, uh, a postgraduate student, which he understands the complications, even a simple subject like physics, chemistry, mathematics, or anything. The level of understanding varies from the grade in which one is studying. I mean, if one is a postgraduate student, many simple things will be obvious to him. So, the very fact that even in secular knowledge, there are different grades of knowledge. So, why not accept that if some people claim that there is a still more higher kind of knowledge, and that kind of knowledge, if they can impart it to us, not only to us, but to whoever seeks it, and if we follow that condition, just as a doctorate or a postdoctorate, he can't simply go from his graduate studies to directly to postdoctorate. He can't say, I want admission here. He will be asked to pass through the different stages and have different levels of knowledge, clear that, and then come to a higher level of study. So also here, if somebody says, just give me the experience, you can't just do it. You have to uh, be admitted into the kindergarten of religion, which are the rituals, which are the outer form of religion. Slowly they guide you, and then they take you to higher and higher knowledge, and finally you learn. Different samadhis are described here only for this reason. So through direct experience, each of these methods of knowledge obtained to different types of samadhi, which we have described in the earlier sutras, has to be found out or discovered. Of course, we can take the help of the Yoga Sutras and meditate in the way we are asked to do, but we have to do it ourselves. And unless we experience, our knowledge is at best external or indirect. Not external, it's a indirect knowledge. It's not something which comes from within. So Swami Vivekananda said realization is religion. The rest is all preparation. Hearing lectures, reading books, reasoning, is just preparing the ground. It's not religion. Intellectual ascent and intellectual descent also are not religion. So these are Swamiji's words. He believed that religion is a very, very practical and empirical kind of research. It can be a very practical. People think religious pursuits are not so practical as the things of the world, the subjects of the world are. But it's not true. Religion, you don't have to take anything on trust or on belief or faith. You accept anything that you experience, only that you have to accept. You accept nothing on this path but your own experience. You go forward alone, though you may be guided by guru and others, and some people who have already traversed this path. But like an explorer, something more like an explorer in a jungle, the virgin jungle, which has unexplored pathways. Spiritual life is like that. There is a scope for infinite number of pathways. That is what Sri Ramakrishna taught. It's like a jungle. You can go through this path, not the trodden paths. If you travel in a city, you have to go on a particular road, or you have to go on some by lanes, but the roads are fixed. Whereas if it's a virgin jungle, nobody has gone there and you are the first person to go, then you will find different ways. You will try to experiment and find different pathways and different routes. The attempt that you do at exploration itself is a spiritual adventure. And certain hints and warnings we can have from, if it is not entirely a virgin, it's a virgin jungle or a fresh forest, then there would have been people, guides, who can tell us, oh, this path is not good, this path is good. So these hints and warnings are what the scriptures give us. They may help us on our way to our goal. So Patanjali also, that is why he gives the different samadhis. Sabija, Nirbija, Savichara, Nirvichara, Savitarka, Nirvitarka, and all those things. So Patanjali says that in Nirvichara Samadhi, the Ritambara Prajna of which we spoke last time, in that the mind becomes pure. Till then, the struggle is to make the mind pure. Once the mind becomes pure, then it is filled with truth. Ritam Bhara. Filled with truth. Ritam means truth. Ritam word is a Sanskrit word, a Vedic word, which literally means truth, the cosmic order, which is truth, the ultimate truth. So Ritam Bhara, Bhara means full of, filled with truth. So that prajna or that consciousness which is filled with truth is said to be pure, because in this state, what actually happens is all the minor insignificant thought waves that give rise to all our troubles, they are swallowed by one great wave of concentration upon a simple or a single object. It need not be simple, it can be anything. It can be a complicated object or a simple object or even a flame or anything. Patanjali is open to all sorts of things, but the concentration is more important rather than the object. But of course, other schools of thought, they don't agree. They say if you meditate on a holy person, the goal can be reached earlier. So there is a partial bhakti and karma yoga and other yogas also involved. It's not just pure Raj Yoga. Of course, says you can take up any object, internal or external, but you will get a result corresponding to the object that you choose, unless you reach the Nirvichara state, Nirvichara Samadhi. There is no meaning of that object remaining. There's absolutely nothing. It is just pure concentration because it's filled with truth. So we find that the seeds of attachment still exist within this one particular wave, though it has gobbled up small waves of attachment, our liking to certain worldly things, our likes, our dislikes, and so many things are there. But we might have rejected them and this big wave might have gobbled it. But still, that big wave also has some kind of seed of attachment. For the moment at least, you'll see that it doesn't do any harm. The attachment, that is why Sri Ramakrishna used to say that attachment to God or attachment to mukti or attachment to moksha, freedom, is not an attachment. Because then you say, of course, you asked us to give up all attachment, then give up attachment to God also. No, that is not what Patanjali says. He says that it can do you no harm because it has served its purpose by gobbling all the little tiny impure desires that we had, which made us more and more bound. That has been removed. So Ritambara Prajna or Nirvichara Samadhi at least purifies the mind. Then what happens? The mind in Nirvichara Samadhi, then it is very easy because after having progressed thus far, it is comparatively easy to take the final step, and that those total annihilation will take place. The bijas will be destroyed. So the Nirvichara Samadhi is supposed to be, it is called Ritambara Prajna because it experiences direct supersensory knowledge, not through the senses. Those who are in, say, contact with some chosen Ishta or ideal or spiritual personality experience direct contact with that personality, not through somebody else, no longer as something subjectively imagined. Subjectively, we may imagine, we may have all sorts of ideas about the God on whom we are meditating, but as something objectively known. We know it as an object, as Sri Ramakrishna knew Mother as somebody with whom he could correspond. That subject-object difference was still there. So say we have meditated on Krishna or Christ or Ramakrishna, or trying to picture anyone of them in our imagination, mental imagination, we will find that a day will come when the picture dissolves. It dissolves not into nothingness, but into the reality of a living presence. That is why a lot of effort has to be made to consider the object or the Ishta on whom we are meditating, the God on whom we are meditating, the image on whom we are meditating, as a living presence. It may not be a living presence right now, That is why Swamiji asked Thakur, do you really see God as you see a human being? He says, why a human being? I see him more in a more intense sense than I see you. Now, what does it mean? That presence becomes so formidable, that presence is so formidable or so intense that it subsumes all the smaller presences, the smaller. So, all the struggles, all the problems of the world, they lose their relative importance. And our mind is occupied with a higher presence, a higher living reality, in which dissolve all these small things dissolve. The function of this meditation or the Nirvichara Samadhi is to select an object which will gobble all the small attachments, all the small troubles, and help us to transcend the problems and sorrows of the world. So in that living presence, the very purpose of experiencing that particular living presence on which we are meditating, it is unlike the original that we have imagined in the mind. So it is like the very often the example of magnet is given. You do not know how the magnet is because the dust is covering it. Either the dust is covering the iron filing and or the magnet, but you don't know anything. But our job is to clean the mud which is covering. That mud is interfering between the two pieces, the two magnets. They are not able to stick with each other. They can't become one with each other. So in the preliminary stages of meditation, we have certain conceptions coming in our mind, in our intellect, and we perceive of the reality in a particular way. But when we really get uh, uh, the final realization after this Nirvichar Samadhi, then we will see that when the dust has been removed, the dirt has been removed from the surface of the magnet, it just goes and sticks. Then the effort seems to come from the larger magnet. Initially, we think that it we have to push this smaller magnet towards the huge magnet, which is like God. But unfortunately, there is so much of dirt, encrustations of centuries, samskaras, which are covering, which are preventing this union with the big magnet. But the moment we clear that dust, moment we wash away that dirt, and that is actually the lower sadhanas which are prescribed by Patanjali. All the other samadhis, they are like gradual, it is like a gradual cleansing of the lower mind so that the bigger mind, the cosmic mind attracts it, or the cosmic reality, the Shiva attracts the Jiva, and it is a spontaneous. Then the magnet, you don't have to push it further. The moment you remove the dirt or the dust or the coating which is there, which was preventing the smaller magnet from getting merged into the bigger magnet, the moment you remove it, then you will see the effect of the grace of the Lord. Lord's grace descends upon us and he attracts us. And then there is nothing coming in between the Jiva and the Shiva. So we become of an outside force, magnetic force of attraction, which draws our mind, as it were, in the desired direction of the bigger magnet, that is the Lord. Effort is no longer our own. That is why in Bhakti they say God is like that big magnet and his power of attraction is always the same. It is we who have to clean through the different sadhanas of Bhakti Yoga or Raj Yoga or Jnana Yoga or Karma Yoga or all the yogas put together in combination through one or many or all of them. We have to cleanse our the lower magnet or our own mind so that the Nirvichara Samadhi, after which the smaller magnet gets attracted to the bigger magnet. Then the question may arise, how can we be sure that the revelations that we are having through these different types of samadhi, whether they are genuine revelations or is it just a hallucination and not some kind of auto hypnosis or some kind of hypnosis? So as I said last time also, there are 2 or 3 tests which we have to remember. These scriptures very clearly indicate that the knowledge obtained must not contradict the knowledge attained by others which are mentioned in the various authentic scriptures. So that is the first step in the initial stages. That is why Shankaracharya says it is paramparagata jnana, the knowledge that is coming down from a parampara. In the beginning, there is no other way. If you start doubting right from day one, then we can't make progress. We have to accept the preliminary steps. So we have to first tally some experiences, small experiences. Do they tally with the uh, what the scriptures have described? How the consciousness can be experienced at different levels. If you know that, then there may be many knowers of truth, but the truth is one, so it can't change. So the idea of Sat, Chit, Ananda and many other such universal ideas cannot be many. They may be expressed in a different language, that's all. But the ideas are same. So it should not contradict previous. That is the first thing. Second, your experience, first is your experience should not contradict past knowledge of all the great masters. Again, it must be a kind of knowledge which cannot be transmitted or understood through any other means. Like you can't say, oh, I have experienced samadhi through the internet. I saw somebody going into samadhi. That cannot be. It cannot be known by any other means than direct perception. That is unknowable. It is ordinary sense perception cannot give rise to that knowledge. If it does, then it is some kind of hallucination. No doubt people see things. Their sense organs temporarily, they are either subdued or numbed by some force of willpower or very strong imagination, and it may give rise to some kind of experience which they think is a supersensuous experience. But to understand whether it is a genuine experience, it's the third and the final test is very important, that it brings with it a complete renewal of the mind and transformation of character. The whole character changes. You see a noticeable difference in the way we look at life. If somebody says, I have had realization, and he keeps quarreling and gets upset at the smallest thing he has to encounter in life, then something is wrong. His life should show the transformation of character is a very clear sign. There cannot be a greater proof than transformation of character. The renewal of the mind itself changes to such an extent that what was previously thought to be impossible, to maintain a balance, maintain a calmness, uh, and when there are things around you are not going on well, all those Sthita Prajna Lakshana, and there are so many indicators which show whether the spiritual experience has really resulted in the transformation of character. That's why Patanjali says the sainthood of a person who has experienced these truths is the final and the conclusive proof. Otherwise, it will remain inconclusive. These things are not seen. The three tests of a genuine spiritual experience, which I discussed uh, just now, that it should not be through the senses, it should be through means which are supersensuous. Second thing, it should not contradict past knowledge of the great scriptures, the world renowned scriptures which have been accepted for centuries and centuries by humankind. And finally, the person who says he has had these experiences which are described in the scriptures, the Bible or the Upanishads or any other Buddhist scripture, if they say that we have had this experience, and if by chance that person continues to be the same or even worse than his previous, his character has not changed for the better, then something is wrong. So that is described. For Patanjali says, Tajjaha sanskaro anya sanskara pratibandhi. The impression, because the impression that these experience, the supreme experience of nirvichar samadhi, is made upon the mind by that samadhi, it wipes out all the past impressions. So you cannot be behaving as a fool or behaving as an attached person after this experience. So after this, he goes on to tell us how to take the ultimate step after this to get complete union with Brahman. Now, these scriptures yogis definitely they say that these states uh, are definitely possible after this nirvichara samadhi. So, but so Swami Vivekananda says, as commenting upon this particular sutra, Tajjah sanskaro anya sanskara pratibandhi. The resulting impression from this nirvichar samadhi, it obstructs or destroys all other impressions. Now, we have seen in the foregoing sutra that the only way of attaining to the superconscious is by concentration. In all the samadhis, whether it is Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savichara, Nirvichara, which is the last one we discussed, they are attainable by concentration, but mere concentration is not enough. What hinders the mind from this concentration are the past samskaras. So a lukewarm type of concentration will not help. Every time the past samskaras come and disturb us, it has to be pressed down, it has to be subdued. So this role is played by the Nirvichara Samadhi helps you to subdue all the past samskaras. That is one of its main functions, and that result is there for everybody to see. If a person says he has had nirvichara samadhi, the only way to test him is to see how much equanimity of mind, how much of attachment he has. If he exhibits an exemplary character, then only we should know that he has had a real experience. So we have all observed that when we are concentrating our mind, our thoughts wander. That is when we start our meditation. When you are trying to think of God, it's the very time this other samskaras seem to appear. They were not there, but suddenly they appear when we try hard to meditate. Then we wonder, where have they come from? They many times, at other times, they may not seem so active. But when you want them not, when we don't want them to come, they come. They're trying to crowd in our mind. Why that happens? So Swamiji says, why should these unnecessary thoughts be more potent when we are meditating at the time of concentration? Why do they come? Normally, why don't they come? We seem to be very peaceful in normal circumstances. But when we try to meditate, these thoughts as it were rush. So because all that while, Swamiji says, all the while we have been repressing them and they react with all their force. It is not just we have not suppressed it with our will. We have just used our unconscious mind, our unconscious will. Will can be conscious or unconscious. So unconsciously something has told us, no, don't do it, don't do it. But we have not done it from the depth of our heart. If we believe stealing is or taking somebody's things is not good, then we should believe it from the bottom of our heart. We don't steal because we are afraid of the police, then that is not the right way. We really should not have that inclination to steal. So that is, we have not repressed it. The fear of the police or the fear of getting caught is not repressing. That is a kind of repression. So it is a strange fear which represses us from doing things which would have normally done. And Swamiji says, you remove all the props and then you will see all the strange kind of behavior these persons do. Because they somehow that repression has gone away, that fear of police, and when they are told that you will be immune, no police will arrest you or harm you. So when all the fears are removed from that person, then he starts behaving as he likes. He takes this freedom for granted and commits sin. That is why commits errors. So the samskaras, when they come, because countless past impressions which were not suppressed with mantra or with some spiritual practice, if you suppress it, it goes away. It gets burnt away. But if it is repressed out of fear, some unknown fear that, oh, maybe the police might catch me, or maybe somebody might notice this, and all those things. So these ideas are rising in our mind and they have been constantly repressed. So that cleaning or that process, they have to be suppressed voluntarily, willingly, using our willpower, and say that, no, I will think of the Lord. Let hundreds of thoughts come. I will fight with them and I will suppress them. I will not repress them. out of fear, but I will positively tell it is not good to have these thoughts. I have to suppress them. Constantly we have to be after them. So but the best way to do it is think of one great idea which does all the job. It consumes or it suppresses voluntarily through the power of the mantra, through the power of the bija, all the smaller thoughts, and to the exclusion of these thoughts, only your ishta or the object on which you are meditating remains primary in your mind. So all the struggling thoughts are slowly killed or slowly destroyed by this big wave. These are the various powers that samskaras in that these are the very powers which of the samskaras which hinder or which obstruct the process which you are following, that is the concentration of mind on any object of your choice. So samadhi, which has just been described, the nirvichar samadhi, is the best to be practiced, is good to practice that, because it has the power of suppressing the latent samskaras which we ourselves might not know. Certain things, certain fears, certain anxieties, certain worries in the corner of our mind. Right now we don't have fear anything, but those tendencies are remaining in the mind. So to destroy that, the power of suppressing those potential samskaras by this concentration, which will become so powerful that it will hold all these powers in check and even kill them. So next verse says, tasyapi nirodhe sarvo nirodha nirbija samadhi. Even now, nirvichara is a slightly lower state than the nirbija. By the restraint of even these kinds of this particular thought, one thought which was gobbling up, after the big whale has gobbled up all the little fishes, then we have to even use that whale, we have to suppress that whale also. We have to restrain that also. Now, what do you mean by that? It is like you use a thorn, remove so many other thorns, but you can't keep that thorn which you used for removing other thorns in the foot. It will pain you. So you have to remove it and throw it away. So this is verse number 51, which says, even the big wave, the mantra, the constant remembrance of God, which was destroying the smaller waves of attachment and trouble and anxieties and all, they will obstruct not only those impressions, but even this big impression, and all these thoughts, when they are restrained totally, there comes the seedless, nirbija, means without seed. That samadhi, if one has, then no more desires, no more rebirth is there. Because for rebirth, the seeds are necessary. Without these seeds, without these desires, without these samskaras, a person doesn't have rebirth. So to get rid of rebirth, we have to attain, as the verse 51 says, tasyapi nirodhe sarva nirodha nirbija. So nirodhat, nirbija, means that nirbija samadhi, seedless is the word they use. What it means is samskara-less. Seed is compared to a samskara. So the seeds have to be destroyed, and that is known as nirbija samadhi. You should always remember, Swamiji says, that one should remember that our goal is to perceive the soul, to become one with the big magnet. We can't perceive the soul because it has got mingled up. It has been covered with nature, with mind, and with the body. Nature is the outer prakriti. The mind, which is a subtle layer, but it is covering, no doubt, the ego that I am a rich person, I am a poor person, I am so and so, I am so and so, and also the external things with the body, the strong body, the good body, and all those things, or even a weak body. All these things give rise to ego. So now the learned man, the person who has studied the scriptures, he thinks the mind is the soul, but the ignorant person thinks the body is the soul. But both of them are mistaken. If you still think that there are two things, one may think I am the soul and the body is my outer covering, but the soul should not get mingled up in all this stuff. As long as it is gross, the different waves of the chitta, they come, they give you different identities, and they cover the soul, as it were. It may be a good ripple, a good wave. So it will give you idea that I am good, but at the same time it binds you. So we see only a reflection of the real soul, the real spirit through these waves. If there is a wave of anger, the person feels that, oh, I am a very angry person. He may regret also. He may say, I am angry. I am angry. Don't irritate me. If we see that there is a person whom we love, and when we see it, there is a wave of love. We are reflected. We feel that we are a loving person because somebody is loving us. We are loving somebody, some object or some person. So that mind full of love gives you an identity of a loving person. So also a angry person. So all these things, the soul's reflections, that we are imperfect, we are good, we are bad, all these things are the various ideas come, which do not come from our soul, but they come from these impressions, these samskaras which you have to destroy. So nirbija means to destroy, to make the remove all the bijas. The real nature of the soul, of the spirit within, is not perceived as long as there is one single wave in the chitta. This real nature will never be perceived until all the waves are subsided. That is why Patanjali second sutra says, Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. The complete restraint. You can't even allow one wave to be there. All the waves have to be subsided someday or the other if one wants nirbija samadhi. Because the seeds give rise to different waves. So if the seeds are burned, then there is no question of the rising of the waves. So first Patanjali teaches us what are the meaning of the waves. What are these different vrittis? The second thing he does is teaches us how to repress them or suppress them, not repress. Repression happens automatically. Nature has kept certain emotions like fear, guilt consciousness, and feeling guilty, and regret, and all those qualities are part of human psyche. So because of these things, a human being is kept in check and the waves are subsided, but it is just due to repression. Once these outer props go away, then we go back to that state with seeds. We get all the different waves start springing up and we don't know how to deal with them. So Swamiji says, even as long as there is a single wave of the chitta, the real nature of the soul cannot be perceived, and all the waves have to be subsided. That is sadhana. So Patanjali teaches what are the different kinds of waves. Then you go to the root of the wave, see that they don't, you try to suppress them with the mantra, with the yoga, with the karma yoga, with different attitudes. We try to repress them. And thirdly, how to make one particular wave so strong that it suppresses all other waves, like fire eating the smaller fires. In Mayavati, I was very much surprised. Once there was a forest fire, and the local people, and of course the Swamis there, they decided to create another bigger fire. I was wondering, a small fire was there, some dried leaves, somebody must have dropped something, and it was slowly spreading, but it was not, it was coming towards the building, which is a very dangerous thing. So a very big fire was created so that the smaller fire got extinguished. It is rather strange, but that is what these people do in the forest. So when the big wave is created, it engulfs, it eats, as it were, all the smaller waves or the smaller fires. So the soul also, all the great wave of is the remembrance of God, that constant vritti, the japa, the constant prayer, the unceasing prayer, as the Christians say, don't stop. Just there is a prayer in the Russian Orthodox Church where they say, "Oh Lord Jesus, have mercy upon me. Oh Lord Jesus, have mercy." It's a prayer which has to be continuously repeated. So the idea of Lord Jesus's mercy the grace of the Lord Jesus, which will cleanse all our mind, our thoughts, our problems, everything will be done by that. So that is the one wave which is induced through mantra. Mantras are cryptic statements which have this bija, which have the additional power of destroying these small waves, the small samskaras. So alone we know that soul is not a compound. It's not that we have a soul and the body is a covering. No, covering is there as long as it exists. But when the mind dies, when we have nirvichara samadhi, then only the pure soul, the infinite Sachidananda alone exists. It cannot die because it is immortal, it is indestructible, it is the ever living essence of what we call as intelligence. Intelligence is a far lower manifestation of this great Sachidananda. So with this we will now end this chapter, because this the new chapter 2, concentration and its uses, concentration and its practice. So now we come to Patanjali's new chapter. I will not start it today. It starts with Tapa, Swadhyaya, Ishvara Pranidhana, Kriya Yoga. It starts with Kriya Yoga. What that Kriya Yoga is, the aphorisms of chapter 2, which we will take up next Friday. So we will be discussing the topic concentration and its practice. Till now, concentration and its uses. That was the heading. So what is yoga? Certain definitions were given. What is different types of samadhi? Everything was described. But now Patanjali decides, first having described what the goal is, he will now show us how to practice this concentration in a systematic way so that you can achieve what was discussed in the previous chapter. So we start with Kriya Yoga, and because we are already running out of time, let us see if there are a few questions. I will answer those questions, and then we will take up chapter 2, the second part of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, in our next class. Now, tomorrow the class will be as usual, but Sunday I may not take the gospel class for one reason. I have to go to Stoke Mandeville Hospital for my biannual. Actually, it was supposed to be done every year, just to see that, test the eyes because of diabetes. So they do all sorts of tests, and they put some kind of fluid to expand the retina. I mean, the pupils get dilated, and they put some drops. So that creates, I may find it difficult to take the class because of the light falling on my face and all. So in case the appointment gets delayed, of course they take a lot of time to check the entire eye. They do the field test and many things. So I may cancel the gospel class, but in any case I will let you know if the tests are over by 2 or 3 o'clock, and if I come back from the hospital on time, and if I have a few hours and I can see properly, then I will hold the gospel class. But most probably I may not be holding the class. So let me see if there are some questions. Yeah. If one is not experienced in a particular events, then telling others that events known as stories, so it should be avoided. No, it is not necessary. You see, there are, if one has not experienced, see, for example, the truths of the Upanishads may not be experienced by the teacher of the Upanishads, but you may experience them, because they have come not, they are not my original creations. They are traditions which have been handed over from time immemorial. A lot of it has come down in a Guru Parampara. But what you are handing over, or the events or the different philosophies you are discussing with others, you have to be a bit cautious and find out that it is backed by tradition. If it is backed by tradition, then it will not harm others. So that is the only caution. But you can definitely, these stories or these incidents, we may not have experienced that kind of bhakti or that kind of yoga or that kind of jnana. But that doesn't mean we should not tell. Maybe somebody else may get an opportunity to practice that sadhana. Very often it happens. That is why truth, when it comes through, definitely if it comes through a realized person, its impact will be more. But in some cases, it has been found, like Tulsidasa's case, the wife was not such a spiritual person, but she played the role of a guru when she told Tulsidas that she just out of disgust, she said, why are you so much attached to this body? You are coming again and again, taking so much of trouble. You come all the way, not allowing me to live quietly. And then she says, if you had the same love for God, you would have realized him. Now, that was a casual statement, this event, or she had, not that she believed in the scriptures, but she inadvertently, she told this out of disgust. And that became a revelation to Tulsidas, and he gave up his whole, he gave up his family, went away, and then lived with Rama alone, and then he became a great saint. So there's nothing, it's not necessary to avoid anything. Truth is the truth. Whether a child tells it, sometimes even small children, without knowing the meaning, they tell some great truths. So we have to accept it. There is no reason why we should not accept a truth just because it has been told by somebody who doesn't have the authority or who has not experienced those truth himself. Now the other question is, how can we calm the mind when samskaras come to disturb our sadhana? Now that is the whole sadhana, as I told you. When other thoughts come, that is the main reason why we do japa. Japa and the mantra sadhana is like creating a very big wave to uh, control the smaller waves. Whatever disturbs you or whatever comes and disturbs you at the time of meditation, that is the only way, the precise reason why we do japa. It's not that we do japa just because some scripture tells us. We do the mantra sadhana, we do the repetition of the mantra to create a bigger wave. The more we repeat, the bigger the wave becomes, and the more intense it becomes. That is the best way, and to not allow our sadhana to be disturbed by the smaller waves. In the beginning, it will be difficult. Say on a particular day, say 100 thought waves are coming in 1 hour, and then you have managed to do japa in spite of that, though most of the time you were not attentive. But next day you will find maybe it has gone down to 90 thoughts, then it might go down to 80 thoughts after several months. Then you will find after so many years that you don't have to, maybe 1 hour you have just done japa and hardly a few thoughts have come. So definitely we can calm the mind. Calming the mind is not the only thing. It is subduing the old samskaras, and the result is calmness. We don't do it because we want to calm down the mind. There are two ways to calm down the mind. Even an idiot's mind is calm. If he doesn't think, his mind becomes calm. Or if he takes some medicine or he goes to sleep, at least for the time being, in deep sleep, he becomes calm. So becoming calm is not the goal of life, but the byproduct of controlling the thought waves, the samskaras, when they come to disturb you, when you control them, when you burn them, then a certain kind of calmness comes as a byproduct of our sadhana. That calmness is good. So calmness is not an indication. You may be calm from outside, but inside there may be the samskaras bubbling, waiting to come out. Next, is Nirbija Samadhi the same as Nirvikalpa Samadhi? It is more or less the same, because here Patanjali explains the Samadhi and certain things in one way, Vedanta teaches in another way, but more or less they are similar. Nirvikalpa means there is no Vikalpa, and Nirbija, when all the Bijas are removed, definitely it is a type of Nirvikalpa Samadhi only. May I ask what living presence or Ishta Thakur himself meditated on? His Divine Mother. For him, the Divine Mother Bhavatarini, whether you take Bhavatarini, Jesus, Christ, or Buddha, or any other God, Krishna, Ramakrishna, it doesn't matter. For him, the Bhavatarini, because he happened to be a priest of that temple, and though their family deity was Raghuvira, Rama, but still, because his brother was employed there as the priest of the, in the beginning, of course, Sri Ramakrishna worshipped Radha Krishna, the smaller temple. His brother was worshipping, elder brother was worshipping in the main temple. But after his passing away, he was forced to worship mother. But his idea was that whatever be that reality, which we call as mother, I should meditate. He just was very keen. When he was praying, when he was singing, when he was doing anything, doing puja, every time his idea was that I want to see the living presence of mother. Is she alive? Is she as real as Ram Prasad says? All the different songs which describe the living presence of the mother. Will I not have that? So that intensity, that yearning he had, and he meditated on that. He meditated on the Divine Mother, and afterwards he meditated on so many other aspects of the Divine Mother. It's not that but he continued his devotion to Ma Kali, but that doesn't mean he restricted himself to Ma Kali. He meditated on Krishna, on whomsoever he meditated, he felt the living presence of that deity. So it really doesn't matter which god or goddess you worship, as long as you get, a stage will come